In 1822, on Sarah Island in Macquarie Harbor, 8 convicts chose the Tasmanian wilderness over the prison meant to break them. Among them was Alexander Pierce, an Irish thief who did not look like the most dangerous man in the group. Their plan was simple, only in theory: run, cross the forest, and reach the settled districts. But once the trees closed behind them, escape stopped being about freedom. It became a question of how much a man would do to stay alive when hunger took everything else away. Before the forest, before the hunger, before 8 men were reduced to 1, there was Sarah Island. It sat in Macquarie Harbor on the wild western coast of Van Diemen's Land, the island now called Tasmania. To reach it, ships had to pass through a narrow entrance known as Hell's Gates. Wind, current, rock, and weather made that passage dangerous even for experienced sailors. Sarah Island was a place for men the colony wanted broken. It was small, wet, isolated, and surrounded by cold harbor water. Beyond that water stood mountains and rainforests so dense the authorities treated them like prison walls. A man might slip a chain, he might get past a guard, he might even reach the mainland shore. But after that came Western Tasmania, rivers without bridges, cliffs without tracks, mud, rain, and scrub so thick it could stop a man as surely as iron bars. The sea was dangerous, the harbor entrance was watched. The settled districts were far away. There were no safe roads leading east, no farms beyond the next ridge, no shelter waiting in the trees. The wilderness itself was part of the sentence. Convicts worked from dawn until dusk, cutting Huon pine. They were sent across the harbor in guarded logging parties, then driven into the timber with axes and saws. The wood was valuable. The men were replaceable. They slept in crowded barracks and ate what supply ships brought, when the ships came. When ships were late, hunger moved through the station. Chains, cold, exhaustion, and fear became ordinary. Among the prisoners was Alexander Pierce. Pierce was an Irishman from County Monaghan, transported for stealing 6 pairs of shoes. He was small, scarred by smallpox, and not the sort of man who looked dangerous in a crowd. But prisons and wildernesses measure people differently. They reward patience, silence, and watchfulness. 7 other men would run with him. Robert Greenhill was strong, forceful, and used to command. He had already been involved in an escape attempt, and desperate men noticed that. Matthew Travers was his close ally. Then there were John Mather, Thomas Bodenham, Alexander Dalton, William Kennelly, and Edward Brown. 8 men, different crimes, different histories, one shared conclusion. Whatever waited beyond Sarah Island might be better than staying there. Their first plan was not to enter the forest. No sensible man would choose that wilderness unless every better option had failed. They planned to seize a boat. With a boat, the harbor could become a road. With luck, they might pass through Hell's Gates and take their chances at sea. On September 20th, 1822, their chance came badly. The men were part of a logging party on the eastern shore of Macquarie Harbor. The morning was cold and gray, mist hung over the water. Guards watched as axes rose and fell into wet timber. Then the moment opened. No boat was ready, no clean route appeared. Behind them were guards, chains, and Sarah Island. Ahead of them were trees, so 8 men ran. Pierce, Greenhill, Travers, Mather, Bodenham, Dalton, Kennelly, and Brown crossed out of prison rules and into a country with rules of its own. The forest closed behind them almost immediately. Western Tasmania was not open country. It was a green barricade. The canopy hid the sky, fallen timber blocked the way, roots caught their feet. Rain soaked their clothing and stayed there. At night the cold settled on them, and by morning the fire, if they could keep one, had given back almost nothing. They had little food. Between all 8 men, they had 1 axe. The axe belonged to Robert Greenhill. Before the first night, that fact became the first law of the escape. Greenhill had the tool that cut firewood, opened scrub, and made shelter possible. In the forest, authority did not wear a uniform. It had a handle and a blade. Travers stood with Greenhill. The others understood the shape of power at once. But the forest did not need to chase them. It simply waited. It took strength by inches. It turned miles into yards. It made each meal smaller, each fire harder, each morning more difficult to begin. By the 8th day, hope had thinned. Alexander Dalton, William Canally, and Edward Brown looked into the mountains and saw cold, hunger, and more unknown country. Then they looked back toward Sarah Island. Back there were chains and punishment, but also a roof and a ration. They turned back. Canally and Brown survived the return and surrendered. Dalton did not. Exhaustion took him somewhere in the bush before he reached the station. 5 men continued: Greenhill, Travers, Mather, Bodenham, Pierce. Now the escape was no longer only a flight from prison. It was a fight against the body itself. The provisions were gone, or close to gone. Clothes were wet, hands were torn, thoughts slowed. Around the 15th day, the group reached a decision that belongs only to extremity. They drew lots. Thomas Bodenham drew the fatal lot. What happened next should be told plainly, but without spectacle. Greenhill killed him with the axe, and the survivors used what remained to keep themselves alive. It was desperation, not wild confusion. Calculation forced by a place that had stripped away every normal choice. 5 became 4. Greenhill still held the axe. Travers still stood with him. That left John Mather and Alexander Pierce in danger. Once the group had crossed that first terrible line, no one could pretend hunger would not return. Pierce watched. He watched Greenhill's hands. He watched how Travers stayed near him. He watched decisions form before anyone spoke. Pierce was not the strongest man in the group, but he understood the new rule. Do not stand alone if you can stand near power. He made himself useful. He stayed close to Greenhill and Travers. John Mather was the next to disappear from the number. The record does not preserve the moment clearly. By then, the men were moving through a private world of rain, hunger, and fear. Days blurred, direction blurred. The old rules of life had been replaced by the immediate need to keep moving, but Mather was gone. Then the wilderness changed the calculation again. Matthew Travers was bitten by a snake. Far from help, the snake bite was a sentence with uncertain timing. Travers weakened. He could not keep pace. He needed help to move. For starving men trying to cross mountains, a wounded companion was weight they could barely carry. By the logic already ruling the escape, Travers had become a liability. But Greenhill would not abandon him. For 5 days, he and Pierce helped carry Travers through wet mountains and tangled forest. Every step cost strength. Every delay increased the danger. But Greenhill's loyalty held longer than survival logic should have allowed. On the 5th day, it broke. When it became clear Travers would not recover, Greenhill killed the man he had carried. He ended the life of his closest ally because the forest had left no room for weakness. And in doing so, he removed the only protection he still had. Now there were 2, Robert Greenhill and Alexander Pierce. Greenhill still had the axe. Pierce had patience, watchfulness, and the knowledge that no alliance remained. Both men understood what the other was thinking. 2 men might travel better than 1, but only until the next crisis. Then 2 would become 1. For 8 days they did not truly sleep. They shared fires, moved through the forest, and watched each other with the fixed attention of hunted animals. They watched hands. They watched eyelids. They watched the axe. At night, rain clicked through leaves. Damp wood smoked in the fire. 2 starving men sat across from each other, each waiting for the other to weaken first. 8 days without real sleep is a kind of torture. Add hunger, cold, wet clothing, and the memory of the men behind them, and the body begins to betray itself. A man can command himself for a while, not forever. On the 8th night, Greenhill slept. Maybe grief had weakened him. Maybe exhaustion finally overcame discipline. Maybe he believed Pierce no longer had the strength to act. Whatever the reason, Greenhill closed his eyes. Pierce took the axe. After that, there was 1 man in the forest. Alexander Pierce had entered the trees with 7 others. Now he stood alone in western Tasmania, carrying the burden of every mile and every decision behind him. But surviving the men did not mean surviving the journey. The wilderness was still there. He had no map, no road, no certain distance to safety, no guarantee that east would lead to people before his body failed. Still, he moved. There is a kind of survival that does not look dramatic from the outside. It is repetitive. Stand up, walk, cut scrub, find water, keep warm. Rest briefly. Listen. Walk again. Pierce did this day after day. He crossed rivers dark with tannin. He pushed through rainforests that seemed to close behind him and erase his passage. He climbed and descended until the mountains began slowly to lose their grip. The scrub thinned, the air opened. The impossible green wall became broken country, then gentler land, then signs that human beings had touched the world. At last he came to a field. In that field were sheep. It was the most ordinary sight imaginable. For Pierce, it may have been astonishing. Sheep meant pasture. Pasture meant a station. A station meant the mapped world. He had walked out of country the authorities believed could not be crossed. He had covered roughly 225 kilometers through wilderness. For the final part, he had done it alone. For a time, Pierce lived among bushrangers. He ate, he slept. But the colony was small and men without papers left tracks. Months later, Pierce was captured near Hobart. Brought before the magistrate, Reverend Robert Knopwood, he told the story from the beginning. He named the men. He described the failed boat plan, the run into the trees, the 3 who turned back, Dalton's death, the Lots, Bodenham, Mather, Travers, Greenhill, and the 8 sleepless days. He told the truth. Knopwood did not believe him. The story was too extreme, too dark, too far beyond what an official mind wanted to accept. The magistrate decided the missing men were probably alive somewhere in the bush, living as outlaws, and that Pierce had invented the rest. So the lone survivor of the impossible crossing was sent back to Sarah Island, back through Hell's Gates, back to the wet barracks, the logging gangs, and the island he had risked everything to escape. That may be the coldest part of the story, the moment when a man described what survival had cost him, and the system answered by returning him to the cage. For more than a year, Pierce lived again inside Macquarie Harbor. Then, in November 1823, he escaped a second time. This time he went with one companion, a young convict named Thomas Cox. The plan was smaller than before. They were trying to move north, keep to the coast, and disappear into the settled districts. Within 10 days, the authorities found Pierce. He was alone. Thomas Cox was missing. Then searchers found evidence on Pierce himself, human remains carried in his pockets. The first confession, dismissed as impossible, now returned in a form no court could ignore. Pierce was taken to Hobart and charged with the murder of Thomas Cox. At trial, disbelief could not protect him. He was found guilty on June 21, 1824. Before his execution, he confessed again to Father Philip Connolly, a Catholic priest. Pierce said that when he and Cox reached the King River, he learned Cox could not swim. To a man reshaped by the first journey, a companion who could not cross a river became a fatal problem. Cox died, and Pierce continued. On July 19, 1824, Alexander Pierce was brought from Hobart Town Jail to the place of execution. Father Connolly attended him. Pierce was hanged at the age of 34. He had been transported from Ireland for stealing 6 pairs of shoes. He had crossed one of the harshest wildernesses in the world. He had told the truth and been disbelieved. He had escaped again, killed again, and this time left evidence no one could dismiss. The ruins of Sarah Island still stand in Macquarie Harbor. Moss and rain work slowly over what the empire built. The forest remains vast. The rivers still run brown. The mountains still rise behind the harbor like a warning. It is easy to judge from a warm room with food nearby and a door that opens. It is harder to imagine 8 men stepping into a forest with no map, no road, and almost no supplies. Harder still to imagine the hunger after 2 weeks, the cold after a month, the terror of sitting across from another man and knowing only one of you may see the next valley. Alexander Pierce was not a hero in any clean sense. Heroes do not do what was done in that forest. But calling him only a monster is too simple as well. He was a man forced into conditions that stripped life down to its harshest question. What will you do to keep breathing? 8 men ran from Sarah Island. 3 turned back. 1 died trying to return. 4 continued. Then hunger, injury, fear, and human choice reduced the number again and again until only Pierce remained. He walked out of the trees after more than 100 days on the run and told a story no one wanted to believe. The wilderness took 7 men. The prison system took the last, but silence did not take the story. 2 centuries later, we still tell it because it sits at the edge of what survival means. It reminds us that nature does not care about courage, that punishment can become cruelty, and that the human will to live can carry a person across impossible distances while leaving scars no map can show. If this story kept you watching, hit the like button, and for more true survival stories from the edge of human endurance, subscribe to Extreme Survival Stories.